This recording is in the public domain. Section 93 of the Legends of the Jews, Volume 3, by Louis Ginzberg, Balak, King of Moab. God allows nothing to stay unrewarded, not even a respectable word remains without its reward. The older of Lot's 2 daughters had called her son that was conceived in guilt Moab by the father, whereas the younger, for the sake of decency, called her son Ammon, son of my people, and she was rewarded for her sense of propriety. For when Moses wanted to overrun the descendants of Lot with war, God said to him, My plans differ from thine. 2 doves shall spring from this nation, the Moabite Ruth and the Ammonite Naomi, and for this reason must these 2 nations be spared. The treatment God bade Israel accord to these 2 nations was not, however, uniform. In regard to Moab, God said, Vex not Moab, neither contend with them in battle, which portended that Israel was not to wage war against the Moabites, but that they might rob them or reduce them to servitude. In regard to the sons of Ammon, on the other hand, God forbade Israel to show these descendants of Lot's younger daughter even the slightest sign of hostility, or in any way to alarm them, so that Israel did not even show themselves in battle array to the Ammonites. Israel's hostile, though not warlike, attitude toward Moab inspired these people and their kings with great fear, so much so that they seemed to be strangers in their own land, fearing as they did that they should have to fare like the Egyptians. For the Israelites had come to Egypt as strangers, but had in time possessed themselves of the land, so that the Egyptians had to rent their dwelling places from them. Their fear was still further increased by their belief that Israel would pay no attention to God's command to them not to wage war against Lot's descendants. This assumption of theirs was based on the fact that Israel had taken possession of the kingdoms of Sihon and Og, even though these had originally been part of Ammon's and Moab's possessions. Heshbon, Sihon's capital city, had formerly belonged to Moab, but the Amorites, thanks to Balaam and his father Beor's support, had taken from Moab these and some other regions. The Amorites had hired these 2 sorcerers to curse Moab, with the result that the Moabites were miserably defeated in the war against Sihon. Woe to thee, Moab! Thou art undone, O people of Chemosh! These and similar utterances were the ominous words that Balaam and his father employed against Moab. Chemosh was a black stone in the form of a woman that the Moabites worshipped as their god. As part of Moab passed into Sihon's possession, so did a part of Ammon fall into Og's hands, and because Israel had appropriated these lands, the Moabites feared they would filch from them all their land. In great alarm they therefore gathered together in their fastnesses, in which they knew themselves to be safe from Israel's attacks. Their fear was in reality quite without foundation, for Israel never dreamed of transgressing God's command by waging war upon Lot's descendants. They might without compunction keep the former provinces of Moab and Ammon, because they took them not from these, but from Sihon and Og, who had captured them. At this time the king of Moab was Balak, who was formerly a vassal of Sihon, and in that capacity was known as Zur. After Sihon's death he was chosen king, though he was not worthy of a rank so high. Favored by fortune, he received royal dignity, a position that his father had never filled. Balak was a fitting name for this king, for he set about destroying the people of Israel, wherefore he was also called the son of Zippor, because he flew as swiftly as a bird to curse Israel. Balak was a great magician who employed for his sorcery the following instrument. He constructed a bird with its feet, trunk, and head of gold, its mouth of silver, and its wings of bronze, and for a tongue he supplied it with the tongue of the bird Yadu'ah. This bird was now placed by a window where the sun shone by day and the moon by night, and there it remained for 7 days, throughout which burnt offerings were offered before it and ceremonies performed. At the end of this week, the bird's tongue would begin to move, and if pricked by a golden needle, would divulge great secrets. It was this bird that had imparted to Balak all his occult lore. One day, however, a flame that suddenly leaped up burned the wings of this bird, which greatly alarmed Balak, for he thought that Israel's proximity had destroyed his instrument of sorcery. The Moabites, now perceiving that Israel conquered their enemies by supernatural means, said, "Their leader had been bred in Midian. Let us therefore inquire of the Midianites about his characteristics." When the elders of Midian were consulted, they replied, "His strength abides in his mouth." Then said the Moabites, "We shall oppose to him a man whose strength lies in his mouth as well." And they determined to call upon Balaam's support. The union of Moab and Midian establishes the truth of the proverb, "Weasel and cat had a feast of rejoicing over the flesh of the unfortunate dog." For there had always been irreconcilable enmity between Moab and Midian, but they united to bring ruin upon Israel, just as weasel and cat had united to put an end to their common enemy, dog. Balaam, the heathen prophet. The man whom the Moabites and Midianites believed to be Moses' peer was none other than Laban, Israel's archenemy, who in olden days had wanted to root out entirely Jacob and all his family, and who had later on incited Pharaoh and Amalek against the people of Israel to bring about their destruction. Hence, too, the name Balaam, devourer of nations, for he was determined to devour the nation of Israel. Just at this time Balaam was at the zenith of his power, for his curse had brought upon the Moabites their defeat at the hands of Sihon, and his prophecy that his compatriot Balak should wear the royal crown had just been fulfilled, so that all the kings sent ambassadors to seek advice from him. He had gradually developed from an interpreter of dreams to a sorcerer, and had not attained the still greater dignity of prophet, thus even surpassing his father, who had indeed been prophet too, but not so notable a one as his son. God would permit the heathens to have no ground for exculpation for saying in the future world, "Thou hadst kept us far from thee." To them, as well as to Israel, he gave kings, sages, and prophets, but whereas the former showed themselves worthy of their high trust, the latter proved themselves unworthy of it. Both Solomon and Nebuchadnezzar were rulers over all the world. The former built the temple and composed many hymns and prayers. The latter destroyed the temple and cursed and blasphemed the Lord, saying, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." Both David and Haman received great treasures from God, but the former employed them to secure a site for God's sanctuary, whereas the latter with his tried to destroy the whole nation. Moses was Israel's prophet, and Balaam was prophet of the heathens. But how great a contrast between these two! Moses exhorted his people to keep from sin, whereas Balaam counseled the nations to give up their moral course of life and to become addicted to lewdness. Balaam was also different from the Israelite prophet in his cruelty. They had such pity for the nations that misfortune among the heathens caused them suffering and sorrow, whereas Balaam was so cruel that he wanted to destroy an entire nation without any cause. Balaam's course of life and his actions show convincingly why God withdrew from the heathen the gift of prophecy. For Balaam was the last of the heathen prophets. Shem had been the first whom God had commissioned to communicate his words to the heathens. This was after the flood, when God said to Shem, "Shem, had my Torah existed among the previous 10 generations, I suppose I should not have destroyed the world by the flood. Go now, announce to the nations of the earth my revelations. Ask them if they will not accept my Torah." Throughout 400 years did Shem go about as a prophet, but the nations of the earth did not heed him. The prophets that labored after him among the heathens were Job and his 4 friends Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, and Elihu, as well as Balaam, all of whom were descendants of Nahor, Abraham's brother, from his union with Milcah. In order that the heathens might not say, "Had we had a prophet like Moses, we should have received the Torah," God gave them Balaam as a prophet, who in no way was inferior to Moses, either in wisdom or in the gift of prophecy. Moses was indeed the greatest prophet among the Israelites, but Balaam was his peer among the heathens. But although Moses excelled the heathen prophet in that God called him without any previous preparation, whereas the other could obtain divine revelations only through sacrifices, still Balaam had one advantage over the Israelite prophet. Moses had to pray to God to show him his ways, whereas Balaam was the man who could declare of himself that he knew the knowledge of the Most High. But because, in spite of his high prophetic dignity, Balaam had never done anything good or kind, but through his evil tongue had almost destroyed all the world, God vowed a vow to his people that he would never exchange them for any other people or nation, and that he would never permit them to dwell in any land other than Palestine. Balak's messengers to Balaam. Balak now sent messengers to Balaam with the following message: "Think not that I ask thy help against Israel exclusively in my own interests, and that thou canst expect from me alone honor and rewards for thy service, but rest assured that all nations will then honor thee, that Canaanites as well as Egyptians will cast themselves at thy feet when thou shalt have destroyed Israel. This people that hath gone out of Egypt hath covered with earth Sihon and Og, the eyes that guarded the whole land, and now they are about to destroy us as well. They are not indeed greater heroes than we, nor are their host more numerous than ours, but they conquer as soon as they open their lips in prayer, and that we cannot do. Try now to see if I may not gradually become their master, so that I may at least lead a certain % of them to destruction, be it only a 24th part of them." Balak himself was even a greater magician and soothsayer than Balaam, but he lacked the gift of properly grasping prophetic observations. He knew through his sorcery that he was to be the cause of the death of 24,000 Israelites, but he did not know in what way Israel was to suffer so great a loss. Hence he requested Balaam to curse Israel, hoping by this curse to be able to restrain Israel from entering the Holy Land. Balak's messengers to Balaam consisted of the elders of Moab and Midian. The latter were themselves great magicians, and by their art established the truth that should Balaam obey Balak's summons, their mission against Israel would be successful. But should he hesitate even for a moment to follow them, nothing was to be expected from him. When they now reached Balaam, and he bade them stay overnight to await his answer, the elders of Midian instantly returned, for they knew that they had now nothing to expect from him. They said, "Is there such a father as hates his son? God is the Father of Israel. He loves them. Shall he now, owing to a curse from Balaam, turn his love into hatred? Indeed, had the matter depended on Balaam's wishes, he would doubtless instantly have acquiesced and followed Balak's summons, for he hated Israel more than Balak, and was much pleased with the commission of the Moabite king." The elders that Balak had sent had besides in their possession all needful instruments of magic, so that Balaam might have no excuse for not instantly following them. But Balaam had, of course, to bide his time and first find out if God would permit him to go to Balak. Hence he bade the Moabite messenger stay overnight, because God never appears to heathen prophets save at night. As Balaam expected, God appeared by night and asked Balaam, "Who are these people with thee?" Balaam was one of the 3 men whom God put to the test and who miserably failed to pass it. When God appeared to Cain and asked, "Where is Abel thy brother?" he tried to deceive God. He should have replied, "Lord of the world, what is hidden and what is open, both alike are known to thee. Why then dost thou inquire after my brother?" But instead of this he replied, "I know not. Am I my brother's keeper?" God therefore said to him, "Thou hast spoken thine own sentence. The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground, and now cursed art thou. Hezekiah acted like Cain when the messengers from the king of Babylon came to him. And Isaiah the prophet asked him, What said these men, and from whence came they unto thee? Hezekiah should have answered, Thou art a prophet of God. Why dost thou ask me? But instead of giving this answer, he replied haughtily and boastfully, They are come from a far country unto me, even from Babylon. On account of this haughty answer, Isaiah announced to the king this prophecy, Behold, the days come, that all that is in thine house shall be carried to Babylon, and of thy sons that shall issue from thee, they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. The scoundrel Balaam, too, should have made answer to God's question, What men are these with thee? By saying, Lord of the world, everything lies open before thee, and nothing is hidden from thee. Why then dost thou ask me? But he, on the other hand, made quite a different answer, and started to boast, saying to God, Although thou dost not distinguish me, and dost not spread my fame over the world, still the kings seek me. Balak the king of Moab has sent to ask me to curse Israel. Then God said, Because thou speakest thus, thou shalt not curse the people, and added, O thou wicked rascal, I said of Israel, He that toucheth them toucheth the apple of my eye, and yet thou wishest to touch them and curse them. Therefore shall thine eye be blinded. Thus Balaam became blind of one eye, as he had already been lame of one foot. Balaam, now perceiving that God did not wish him to curse Israel, said, If it be so, then I shall bless them. God, they have not need of thy blessing, for they are blessed. God said to Balaam, as one says to a bee, Neither thy honey nor thy sting. Balaam accepts Balak's invitation. On the following morning, Balaam gave the elders of Moab his answers, saying that he would not follow Balak's call, but not betraying to them the truth that God had forbidden him to curse Israel. He said instead, God said to me, Go not with these men, for that would be beneath thy dignity, but await nobler ambassadors. Balaam's plan was to insult Balak so that he should send no further messengers to him, and no one might discover that he could accomplish nothing beyond the word of God. His expectations, however, were disappointed. The ambassadors, in their turn, not quite painstaking in their representation of the truth, told their king that Balaam considered it beneath his dignity to appear in their escort, making no mention of God, but speaking as if the refusal came simply and exclusively from Balaam. Balak thereupon sent more honorable ambassadors to Balaam until he was at last obliged to admit that he could undertake nothing against God's command. Even then, it is true, he did not admit that his acceptance or refusal of Balak's invitation depended entirely upon God, but declared that he could, if he wished, do as he chose, but did not choose to transgress God's prohibition. In his second embassy, Balak promised Balaam more for his service than he had offered him the first time. Balaam's answer was as follows, If Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God. These words characterize the man who had three bad qualities: a jealous eye, a haughty spirit, and a greedy soul. His jealousy was the reason why he wanted to curse Israel, whom he envied for their good fortune. In his haughtiness, he told the first messengers the falsehood that God would not let him go with them because it would be beneath his dignity, and his avarice was expressed in his answer to the second embassy, in which he not only surreptitiously mentioned Balak's gold and silver, but spoke his mind by explaining to them that their master could not adequately compensate him for his service, saying if Balak were to hire hosts against Israel, his success would still be doubtful, whereas he should be certain of success if he hired me. He did not, however, give even the second embassy a decisive answer, but said to them also, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more. Now therefore I pray you, tarry ye also here this night, that I may know what the Lord will speak unto me more. These words of his held unconscious prophecies. I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord was as much as to say that he could not put the blessings of God to Israel to naught. Tarry ye also here this night contained the prophecy that this second embassy would be as much disappointed as the first, for although Balaam accompanied the second messenger, still he had no power to curse Israel, but only to bless them. Finally, the words, what the Lord will speak unto me more, held a prediction that God would bestow even more benedictions upon the Israelites through him. God permits man to go upon the way he chooses to go. When God appeared to Balaam the first time, he said to him, Thou shalt not go with them. But when Balaam still did not relinquish his desire to go to Balak, God would not interfere. Hence, at his second appearance, God said to Balaam, If the men be come to call thee, rise up, go with them, but only the word which I speak unto thee, that shalt thou do. Audacity prevails even before God. Balaam's steadfast insistence upon his wish wrested from God his consent to Balaam's journey to Moab. He warned him of its consequences, saying to him, I take no pleasure in the destruction of sinners, but if thou art bound to go to thy destruction, do so. Whosoever leads righteous men astray upon an evil way will fall into the ditch of his own digging. Balaam was misled by God's behavior toward him, and thus plunged into destruction. When God first appeared to him and asked him, What men are these with thee? This blasphemer thought, God knows them not. It seems clear that there are times when he is not aware of what goes on, and I shall now be able to do with his children as I wish. Balaam was misled by God because he had with his words seduced to unchastity people who had up to this time lived in purity. God's apparent change of decision that first prohibited him from going to Balak and then permitted him to do so completely bewildered him, so that he thought God at first said to me, Go thou not with them, but the second time he said, Go with them. So too will he change his words, curse them not, into curse them. Just as Balaam was confused by God, so too were the magicians that Balak had sent to him. At the first visit, these had, through their magic lore, established that he would accept Balak's invitation, but God made him decline it. At the second time, on the other hand, they established that he would not accept the invitation, and God made him obey their summons. Balaam's ass. Balaam could hardly await the morning, rejoicing no less than Balak's messengers at God's consent to his journey to Balak, and still hoping that he might succeed in bringing disaster upon Israel. In his haste to set out, he himself saddled his ass, although he did not lack servants, whereupon God said, O thou villain, their ancestor Abraham forestalled thee, for he too rose up early in the morning and in person saddled his ass to lead Isaac to sacrifice in fulfillment of the command that had reached him. The ass that Balaam took with him had been created on the 6th day of the creation. He had received it as a gift from Jacob, that he might not give evil counsel to Pharaoh concerning Jacob's children. It was upon his advice, nevertheless, that Pharaoh forced the Israelites to make bricks. He took his 2 sons, Jannes and Jambres, for it behooves a nobleman always to have at least 2 companions upon any journey that he undertakes. Although God had now granted him permission to go on the journey, still his wrath was kindled when he set out. God said, Behold this man, he knows that I read each man's heart, and knows also that he departeth only to curse Israel. This wickedness on his part had the result that even the angel of mercy turned against him as an enemy, standing in his way. At first the ass alone perceived the angel and not Balaam, for God has so arranged it that human beings may not perceive the angels that surround them, or else they would through terror lose their reason. The ass, on the other hand, instantly perceived the angel. He at first stood in her way as she was in the middle of the road, so that she could turn aside on both sides. Then she perceived him when the road narrowed, and she could turn to one side only. And finally she reached a spot where there was no road at all, to which she could turn either on this side or on that. This was to teach Balaam the following lesson. If he wished to curse Abraham's children, he should have leeway on both sides, Ishmael's children and Keturah's children. If he wanted to curse Isaac's children, one side would still be open to him, Esau's children. But if he wanted to curse Jacob's children, he should never bring it to pass, for they are protected on both sides, on the one hand by Abraham and Isaac, on the other by Jacob and Levi, while God watches over them from above. The wall on this side and on that side, through which place he had to pass, were furthermore to indicate to him that he could not become master over Israel, who have in their possession the tables of the law that were written on both their sides. When the ass reached the wall that Jacob and Laban had erected as a token that they would never pass over it for harm, she thrust her feet against it to punish him for having broken his agreement with Jacob. Balaam, who had with blows attempted to make the ass walk straight ahead, flew into a rage when she lay down altogether and would not budge from the spot, so that he smote her all the more. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the ass and permitted her to use speech, a gift that she had possessed ever since her creation, but had not until then used. She said, "What have I done unto thee, that thou hast smitten me these 3 times?" The first words of the ass were so chosen as to call Balaam's attention to the wickedness and uselessness of his undertaking against Israel. 3 times was to remind him that he wished to curse a nation that 3 times in every year arranged pilgrimages to the Lord. The ass's speech was altogether to serve as a warning to Balaam to beware of his mouth and not to curse Israel. The ass, through her speaking, was to instruct him that the mouth and the tongue are in God's hand. Balaam answered the ass in the language in which she had addressed him, in Hebrew, which he did not, however, speak fluently. He said, "Because thou hast mocked me, I would there were a sword in mine hand, for now I had killed thee." The ass thereupon replied, "Thou canst not kill me, save with a sword in thy hand. How then wilt thou destroy an entire nation with thy mouth?" Balaam was silent, knowing no reply. The ass did not only make him ridiculous in the eyes of the elders of Moab that accompanied him, but she also exposed him as a liar. For when the ambassadors asked him why he had not chosen a horse rather than an ass for his journey, he answered that his saddle horse was in the pasture. Then the ass interrupted him, saying, "Am not I thine ass, upon which thou hast ridden all thy life long? Balaam, I use thee as a beast of burden, but not for the saddle." The ass, "Nay, upon me hast thou ridden since thine earliest day, and thou hast always treated me with as much affection as a man treats his wife." Balaam had now to admit that the ass had spoken the truth. Balak's princes were much amazed at this extraordinary miracle, but the ass died the moment she had spoken what she had to say. God did this for 2 reasons. Firstly, because he feared that the heathens might worship this ass were she to stay alive, and secondly, because God wanted to spare Balaam the disgrace of having people point to his ass and say, "This is she that worsted Balaam." By this action it can be seen how highly God prizes the honor of pious men, if he even sought to spare the honor of this villain. It is out of consideration to mankind also that God has closed the mouth of animals, for were they to speak, man could not well use them for his service, since the ass, the most stupid of all animals, when she spoke, confounded Balaam, the wisest of the wise. Balaam runs into his own destruction. While all this was going on, Balaam still did not perceive that God's angel stood before him. God meant to show him that in his hand is not only the tongue of man, but his eye as well, so that as long as he chooses, man will fail to see what is directly before his nose. But God suddenly permitted Balaam to see the angel with a sword drawn in his hand, and Balaam fell flat on his face. For being uncircumcised, Balaam might not listen to the words of God or of an angel standing erect. Hence, upon perceiving the angel, who instantly began to address him, Balaam cast himself upon the ground. The sword in the angel's hand did not signify that he meant to strike Balaam, for a breath from his mouth would have sufficed to kill myriads, but it was to point out the following truth to Balaam. The mouth was given to Jacob, but to Esau and to the other nations the sword. Thou art about to change thy profession, and to go out against Israel with his own weapon, and therefore shalt thou find death through the sword that is thy own weapon. The angel now said to Balaam, If I have been commissioned to demand restitution from thee for the injustice thou hast offered to the ass, that can show neither meritorious deeds of her own nor of her father's, how much the more must I stand up as the avenger of an entire nation, that have their own merits and can refer to the merits of their fathers. But to return to the ass, why didst thou smite her that turned from the road only because she saw me and was frightened? Balaam was a shrewd sinner, for he knew that divine punishment could be averted only by penitence, and that the angels have no power to touch a man who, after sinning, says, I have sinned. Hence he said to the angel, I have sinned, but added, I did not set out until God said to me, Rise up, go with them. And now thou sayest to me, Return. But this is the Lord's way. Did he not also at first tell Abraham to sacrifice his son? And then he caused an angel to call out to him, Lay not thine hand upon the lad. It is his custom first to give a command, and then through an angel to recall it. So also did he indeed say to me, Go with them. But if it displeaseth thee, I shall turn back. The angel replied, All that I have done was to thy advantage, but if thou art bound to plunge into destruction, do so. Go with these people, but destruction is decreed for all of you. Think not, however, that thou shalt do as thou wilt, for thou shalt have to say what I desire thee to speak, and to restrain what I wish to remain unuttered. In spite of the warnings he had received from God and the angel, he was not to be restrained from taking this fatal step, but in his hatred toward Israel still cherished the hope that he should succeed in obtaining God's consent to curse Israel, and he continued his journey in this happy expectation.
Balaam with Balak. Whensoever God wished to humble an evildoer, he at first exalts him, to fill him with pride. So too he humbled Balaam after exalting him, for at first Balak had sent princes of little distinction to him, whereupon God said to him, Thou shalt not go with them. When, however, he sent many renowned princes to him, God said to Balaam, Go with them. But this journey brought him nothing but humiliation and ruin, for he fared in accordance with the proverb, Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. God does this so that men might not say, Whom hath God destroyed? Surely not that insignificant person. Hence God exalts sinners before their fall. When Balaam approached the Moabite boundaries, he sent messengers to Balak to announce his arrival, And Balak went forth to his country's border to meet him. Pointing to the boundary lines, Balak said to Balaam, "These have been fixed since Noah's days, that no nation might push into the realm of another, but Israel set out to destroy the boundaries, as their attitude toward Sihon and Og shows into whose kingdoms they entered." He then greeted him with the words, "Did I not twice send unto thee to call thee? Wherefore camest not thou unto me? Am I not able indeed to promote thee to honor?" Balak unconsciously uttered a prophecy, for in truth Balaam went hence in disgrace and dishonor, and not covered with glory, as he could not fulfill the other's wish to curse Israel. It should now have been Balaam's duty, had he really desired to be of service to the king of Moab, to say to him, "Why dost thou attempt to do what will bring thee misfortune and finally utter ruin?" But he spoke quite differently instead, boastfully bragging with his gift of prophecy, pointing out that he was the last prophet among the heathens. "And," continued he, "I, the last prophet among the heathens, shall thus counsel thee. The ancestor of that nation erected to God an altar upon which thrice annually he offered up 7 oxen and 7 rams. Do thou then erect 7 altars, and offer up on each 7 oxen and 7 rams. God laughed when he heard this counsel, saying, Every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell thee, for the world is mine, and the fullness thereof. Will I eat the flesh of bulls, or drink the blood of goats? Balak led his guest from the borderline to the interior of the land, taking pains to show him great multitudes of the people, having bazaars erected for that purpose. Pointing to these multitudes, among which there were also many children, Balak said, Look thou, how Israel planned to destroy these multitudes of people that have done them no injury. Balak slew for Balaam's welcome 1 ox and 1 sheep, proving the proverb, The pious promise little and do much, the wicked promise much and do little. Balak had sent word to Balaam, saying, I will promote thee unto very great honor. Yet when he arrived, he offered him for food only 1 ox and 1 sheep. Suppressing his rage, Balaam thought, Is that all that he offers me? He will have to pay for this tomorrow, for he instantly determined to have him offer up many sacrifices on the following day to punish him for having treated him in so niggardly a fashion.
Balaam's sacrifices refused. On the following morning, Balak took Balaam and brought him upon into the high places of Baal. For Balak was even a greater magician and soothsayer than Balaam, who allowed himself like a blind man to be led by him. He led him to this spot because through his magic lore he knew that Israel was to suffer a great misfortune upon the heights of Baal Peor, and he thought it was to be Balaam's curse that would effect this disaster upon them. The relation of these 2 men to each other was like that between 2 men, one of whom has a knife in his hand, but does not know what part of the body to strike for slaughter, and the other knows the part of the body, but has no knife. Balak knew the place where disaster awaited Israel, but did not know how it was to be brought about, whereas Balaam knew how evil is conjured up, but did not know the places set for disaster, to which Balak had to lead him. Balaam's superiority over Balak and the other magicians lay in this, that he could accurately determine the moment in which God is wrathful, and it was for this reason that his curse was always effective, because he knew how to curse at the very instant of God's anger. It is true that God is angry for 1 instant every day, to wit, during the 3rd hour of the day, when the kings with crowns upon their heads worship the sun, but this moment is of infinitesimally short duration. Fully 85,088 such moments make an hour, so that no mortal save Balaam had ever been able to fix that moment, although this point of time has its outward manifestations in nature, for while it lasts, the cock's comb becomes absolutely white, without even the smallest stripe of red. God's love for Israel, however, is so great that during the time that Balaam prepared to curse Israel, he did not wax angry at all, so that Balaam waited in vain for the moment of wrath. Balaam now tried to obtain God's consent for Israel's curse through sacrifices, and hence bade Balak erect 7 altars upon the high place of Baal, corresponding to the 7 altars that since Adam had been erected by 7 pious men, to wit, Adam, Abel, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. When the altars had been erected, he said to God, "Why didst thou favor these people, if not for the sacrifices that they offered thee? Were it not better for thee to be adored by 70 nations than by 1? But the Holy Spirit answered, Better is a dry morsel and quietness therewith than an house full of sacrifices and strife. Dearer to me is a dry offering of meal than all these many flesh offerings by which thou strivest to stir up strife between me and Israel." Now was Balaam's fate decided, for by his conduct he put himself into direct opposition to God, and hence his destruction was decreed, and from that moment the Holy Spirit of prophecy left him, and he was nothing more than a magician. For Israel's sake, however, God granted him the honor of his revelation, but he did so grudgingly, as one loathes to touch an unclean thing. Hence he would not permit Balaam to come to him, but rather appeared to Balaam. God's different treatment of Balaam and of Moses at the revelation is evident, for whereas the latter betook himself to the sanctuary to hear God's words, the former received God's revelation at any place whatsoever. It characterizes God's attitude toward them. 2 men once knocked at a magnate's door, the one being a friend who had a request to make, and the other a leprous beggar. The magnate said, "Let my friend enter, but I shall send the beggar's alms to the door, that he may not enter and pollute my palace." God called Moses to him, whereas he did not desire Balaam to come to him, but betook himself there. He found Balaam at the 7 altars that he had erected, and said to him, "What doest thou here?" Whereupon Balaam answered, "I have erected for thee as many altars as the 3 fathers of Israel, and I have offered upon them bullocks and rams." God, however, said to him, "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. Pleasanter to me is the meal of unleavened bread and herbs that the Israelites took in Egypt than the bullocks that thou offerest out of enmity. O thou knave, if I wished for offerings, I should order Michael and Gabriel to bring them to me. Thou art mistaken if thou believest that I should accept offerings from the nations of the world, for I have vowed a vow to accept such from Israel alone." God thereupon handed him over to an angel, who entered and settled in his throat, and would not permit Balaam to speak when he wanted to curse Israel. Balaam extols Israel. Balaam now turned back to Balak, who awaited him with his princes. He now wanted to begin to curse Israel, but his mouth, far from being able to utter the words, was on the contrary compelled to praise and bless Israel. He said, "I found myself upon the high places in company with the patriarchs, and thou, Balak, hast cast me down from the heights. Through thee did I lose the gift of prophecy. Both of us are ungrateful men if we wish to undertake evil against Israel, for had it not been for their father Abraham, for whose sake God saved Lot out of the ruin of the cities, there should not be no Balak. For thou art one of Lot's descendants, And had it not been for Jacob, I, Laban's descendant, should not now be on earth, for no sons were born unto Laban until after Jacob had come into his house. Thou didst bring me out of Aram to curse Israel, but it was this land that their father Abraham left, laden with blessings, and it was this land also that their father Jacob entered, laden with blessings. Shall now a curse come upon them from this land? How can I curse them, if he that curseth them bringeth a curse upon himself? Thou, moreover, wishest me even to curse Jacob. Hadst thou urged me to curse a nation that were only the descendants of Abraham or of Isaac, I might have been able to do so. But to curse Jacob's descendants is as bad as if a man were to come to a king and say to him, The crown that thou wearest upon thy head is worthless. Would such a man be permitted to live? The Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. In Israel, said the Lord, will I be glorified. How now should I curse them? How shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? Even when they have been worthy of a curse, they have not been cursed. When Jacob went in to receive the blessings, he went in through craft, and said to his father, I am Esau, thy firstborn. Doth not he deserve a curse, out of whose mouth issueth a lie? Yet far from being cursed, he was even blessed. Ordinarily, a legion that stirs up sedition against their king is declared guilty by death. But Israel had denied God, saying, These be thy gods, O Israel. Should they not then have been destroyed? God, however, did not even at that moment withdraw from them his love, but left to them the clouds of glory, manna, and the well, even after they had adored the calf. Howsoever often they sinned, and God threatened them with a curse, still he did not say that he would bring it upon them, whereas in his promises of blessings he always tells them that he himself would send them upon Israel. How shall I curse when God doth not curse? Israel is a nation of whom God thought even before the creation of the world. It is the rock upon which the world is founded. For when God was considering the scheme of the creation, he thought, How can I create the world if the idolatrous generation of Enosh and the generation of the flood will arouse my anger? He was about to desist from the creation of the world when he saw before him Abraham's form, and he said, Now I have a rock upon which I can build, one upon which I can found the world. How too should I curse this nation that are protected and surrounded by the merits of the patriarchs and the wives of the patriarchs, as if by lofty mountains and steep hills, so that if Israel sin, God forgives them as soon as Moses prays to him to be mindful of the patriarchs. I was in error when I believed Israel could be easily attacked, but now I know that they have taken deep root in the earth and cannot be uprooted. God forgives them many sins out of consideration for their having preserved the token of the Abrahamic covenant, and as powerless as I am to curse them alone, just as powerless am I to curse them together with another nation, for it is a people that shall dwell alone, and shall not be reckoned among the nations. Israel is distinguished from all other nations by their custom, by their food, by the token of the covenant upon their bodies, and by the token upon their doorposts. Wherefore God doth not judge them at the same time with other nations, for he judges the latter in the darkness of the night, but the former in bright daylight. Israel is a separate people. Alone they enjoy the blessings God gives them. No other nation rejoices with Israel. So too, in the Messianic time, Israel will quite alone rejoice in delights and pleasures, whereas in the present world it may also partake of the universal welfare of the nations. I am not able to accomplish anything against a nation that zealously fulfills God's commandments, and that owes its existence to the devotion with which the wives of the patriarchs obeyed the commandments of God. Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his. Balaam in these words spoke an unconscious prophecy, to wit, that he should be entitled to participate in the fate of the righteous, to his share in the future world, if he died the death of the righteous, a natural death, but not otherwise. He died, however, a violent death, and thus lost his share in the future world. Balaam's hopes disappointed. When Balak saw that Balaam, instead of cursing, praised and exalted Israel, he led him to the top of Pisgah, hoping that he might there succeed in cursing Israel. By means of his sorcery, Balak had discovered that Pisgah was to be a place of misfortune for Israel. Hence he thought that Balaam would there utter his curse against Israel. He was, however, mistaken. The disaster that there awaited Israel was the death of their leader Moses, who died there, and God refused to grant Balaam's wish on this spot also. God indeed appeared to Balaam, but what he said to him was, "Go again unto Balak, and bless Israel." Balaam now did not wish to return to Balak at all, to disappoint him a second time, but God compelled him to return to Balak and communicate to him the blessings of Israel. Balaam now turned back to Balak, whom he found standing by his burnt offering. But whereas on the first occasion the king had awaited Balaam, surrounded by all his princes, Balaam now saw only a few notables surrounding Balak. Most of the princes had deserted their king without awaiting Balaam, for they expected nothing further from him after the first disappointment he had caused them. Balak as well did not now receive him as kindly, but mockingly asked, "What hath the Lord spoken?" hinting in this way that Balaam was unable to say what he wished, but only what God willed. Balaam replied to these scornful words of Balak, "Rise up, Balak, thou mayest not be seated when God's words are spoken. God is not like a man of flesh and blood, that makes friends and disowns them as soon as he finds such as are better than they. God is not so, for he doth not cancel the vow he had made to the patriarchs, for he promised to bestow Canaan upon their descendants, and he fulfilleth his promise. He always fulfills what he hath promised to Israel, but allows the evil with which he threatens them to be unfulfilled as soon as they repent them of their sins. God sees not their sins, but he seeth their good deeds. Thou, Balak, sayest to me, Come, curse Jacob for me. But a thief can enter a vineyard that hath a keeper only if the keeper sleeps. But he that keepeth Israel neither sleepeth nor slumbereth. And how then can I enter their vineyard? If, however, thou dost think that I cannot harm Israel on account of Moses, who is their keeper, know then that his successor will be as invincible as he, for through the sound of trumpets he will overthrow the walls of Jericho. Thou, Balak, furthermore sayest, A people hath gone forth out of Egypt, but they have not only gone forth. God brought them forth out of Egypt, who combines in himself the powers of the angels and of the invisible demons. Swift as the flight of a bird doth fortune as well as misfortune come upon Israel. If they sin, God suddenly plunges them down, but if they act well in the sight of the Lord, God exalts them as quickly as a cloud. Thou, Balak, hast repeatedly tried to discover in what spot thou shouldst be able to work them woe, but they will have nothing to do with sorceries. They baffle and put to naught the sorceries and prophecies of other nations by their pious deeds. When they set forth into battle, they practice no magic, but the high priest, clad in the Urim and Thummim, consults God about the outcome of the battle. There will even be a time when Israel will sit before the Lord like a pupil before his master, and will receive the revelation of the secrets of the Torah from him, so that even the angels will consult Israel concerning the secrets revealed to them by God. For the angels are not permitted to approach God as closely as the Israelites in the Messianic time. There is not indeed upon the earth a nation like Israel. The last thing they do before going to sleep is to devote themselves to the study of the Torah and the fulfillment of its laws. And this also is their first occupation upon awakening. As soon as they arise, they recite the Shema and adore God, and not until after they have done this do they go about their business. If evil spirits come to attack them, or if disaster threatens them, they worship their God, and as soon as they utter the words, "The Lord our God is one Lord," the harmful spirits become powerless against them, and whisper after them the words, "Praised be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever." When at night they retire, they again recite the Shema, whereupon the angels of the day pass on the trust of guarding them to the angels of night, and when upon awakening they again worship their Lord, the angels of the night again pass them on to be guarded by the angels of day. When Balak for the second time saw that Balaam, instead of cursing, blessed Israel, he brought him to the top of Peor, thinking that peradventure it would please God to have him curse them from thence. For by his sorcery Balak had discovered that a great disaster was to fall upon Israel on the top of Peor, and thought that this disaster might be their curse from Balaam. He was, however, mistaken in this supposition, for the disaster in that spot was none other than Israel's sin with the daughters of Moab, and God's punishment for this. Curses turned to blessings. Balaam, on the other hand, made no further attempts to induce God to curse Israel, but thought he might be able to bring misfortune upon Israel by enumerating the sins they had committed in the desert, and in this way to conjure up God's wrath against them. But the desert had also been the place where Israel had accepted the Torah, hence the mention of the desert called up God's love instead of his wrath. Balaam himself, when he let his eyes wander over the camp of Israel, and perceived how their tents were so pitched that no one might see what was going on in the homes of the others, found himself compelled to burst into praises of Israel, and under the inspiration of the prophetic spirit, the curses he had intended to speak were changed in his mouth into blessings, and he spoke of the extent and importance of the king of Israel. But whereas Moses blessed his people in a low, quiet voice, Balaam spoke his words of blessing in a very loud voice, so that all the other nations might hear and out of envy make war upon Israel. Balaam's blessings were therefore accounted to him not as blessings, but as curses. God said, "I have promised Abraham, and I will bless them that bless thee, and him that curseth thee will I curse. Hence will I account Balaam's blessings as curses," and indeed all of Balaam's blessings later turned to curses, except his blessing that houses of teaching and of prayer should never be missing among Israel. Balaam furthermore announced the events that would come to pass at the time of David's sovereignty, and also what will happen at the end of days, in the time of Messiah, when Rome and all other nations will be destroyed by Israel, excepting only the descendants of Jethro, who will participate in Israel's joy and sorrows. Yea, the Kenites are to be the ones to announce to Israel the arrival of the Messiah, and the sons of the Kenite Jonadab are to be the first at the time of the Messiah to bring offerings at the temple and to announce to Jerusalem its deliverance. This was Balaam's last prophecy. After this, the prophetic spirit left Balaam, and God in this way granted Moses' wish to reserve the gift of prophecy as a special distinction to Israel. Balaam was the last prophet of the nations. Balaam's wicked counsel. Although Balaam had not been able to fulfill Balak's wish and curse Israel, still he did not leave him before giving him advice as to how he might bring ruin to Israel, saying, "The God of this people loathes unchastity, but they are very eager to possess linen garments. Pitch tents then, and at their entrances have old women offer these articles for sale. Induce them in this way to enter the interior of the tents, where they will be surprised by young harlots who will seduce them to unchastity, so that God may punish them for their sin." Throw the stick up in the air, it will always return to its original place. The Moabite nation that owes its existence to the illegal relations of Lot with his daughter could not deny its origin, and followed Balaam's counsel to tempt Israel to unchastity. They pitched tents, filled them with pretty women, whom they provided with valuable things, and had old women take up their posts at the doors of the tents, whose task it was to lure the passing Israelites into the interior. If an Israelite passed to buy something of the Moabites, the old women at the entrance to the tent would thus address them: "Dost thou not wish to buy linen garments that were made in Bet-shan?" Then they would show him a sample of the goods and name the price, and finally add, "Go within, and thou wilt see wares still more beautiful." If he went within, he was received by a young woman who was richly adorned and perfumed, who would at first set for him a price much lower than the value of the goods, and then invite him to do as if he were at home, and to choose the article he liked best. While he sat there, he was treated with wine, and the young woman invited him to drink with the words, "Why do we love ye while you hate us? Are we not all descendants of one man? Was not Terah our ancestor as much as yours? If thou wilt not eat of our sacrifices, or what we have cooked, here are calves and fowl, that thou mayest slaughter in accordance with thy law." But as soon as the Israelite had allowed himself to be persuaded to drink, he was absolutely in the hands of the shameless woman. Intoxicated with wine, his passion for the woman was soon kindled, but she agreed to satisfy his desires only after he had first worshipped Peor, the god of the Moabites. Now, the worship of this idol consisted in nothing else than the complete baring of the body. Hence the Israelites, seeing no evil in it, declared themselves willing to follow the summons of the Moabite women, and in this way they were seduced both to unchastity and to idolatry by the Moabite women. At first the men were ashamed, and committed this whoredom with the Moabite women in secret, but they soon lost this feeling of shame, and betook themselves two by two to their lewd actions. Israel's moral degeneration is to be partly explained by this, that the place where they found themselves was apt to tempt them to lewdness. For there are springs whose waters have various effects upon those who partake of them. One kind of water strengthens, another weakens. One makes beautiful, another makes ugly. One makes chaste, another brings about lewdness. Now there was in Shittim, where the Israelites then dwelt, the well of lewdness, out of which the inhabitants of Sodom had erstwhile fetched water, but from which, since the destruction of the sinful cities, no one had drunk, and for this reason the people had until then been chaste. But Israel, as soon as they tasted of this water, gave up their chaste manner of life. This disastrous spring will lose its force only in the Messianic time, when God will cause it to dry up.